welcome to another episode of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. I'm Ben Watkins, and I'll be your host today. In today's episode, I want to discuss at least three things: presuppositional apologetics, objective idealism, and then a few brief remarks on the argument from Divine Hiddenness. So let's start with presuppositional apologetics. There's a notorious tradition of Christian presuppositional apologetics online, but there's also a Christian tradition of it, specifically the Tillian tradition, that is more serious and makes more analytically respectable claims as far as what is often associated with the study of knowledge, often called epistemology. And so this tradition, the Tillian tradition of presuppositional apologetics, claims that knowledge implies theism because God is a necessary condition for the intelligibility of the world and its ability to know itself. According to this view, if there were no God, then we could not know anything at all because God's divine revelation is a necessary precondition for knowledge. Because everyone knows something, it follows everyone knows God exists. So Van Til puts it like this: if one does not make human knowledge wholly dependent upon the original self-knowledge and consequent revelation of God to man, the man will have to seek knowledge within himself as the final reference point. Then he will have to seek an exhaustive understanding of reality. He will have to hold that he cannot attain to such an exhaustive understanding of reality. He has no true knowledge of anything at all. Either man must then know everything, or he knows nothing. This is the dilemma that confronts every form of non-Christian epistemology. Presuppositional apologetics takes several implications from this. So, for example, if someone denies God exists and they admit they do not know everything, then they must be somehow suppressing a knowledge of God. Additionally, there is no neutral epistemological ground between the Christian and the non-Christian to resolve their disagreements. Any conversation about the coherence of theism, the uniformity of nature, or the place of Christianity in anyone's life, we must either presuppose Christian theism or succumb to total skepticism and admit that knowledge is impossible. According to Psalm 14, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. And according to Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and righteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. My aim here is going to be twofold. I want to first respond to Van Til's claims by putting forward a form of objective idealism, recently defended by Sebastian Rodel in his wonderful book, Self-Consciousness and Objectivity. And then in closing, I want to turn the tables on the presuppositional apologist and argue that not only are there people who sincerely believe that God does not exist, our knowledge of such people is actually evidence against God. This is the well-worn argument from Divine Hiddenness, as defended by people like J.L. Schellenberg in his wonderful book, The Hiddenness Argument. And in case you've missed it, my co-host Justin Schieber has put together a series going much more in depth into the reasoning of the Hiddenness argument. If you've not seen that series yet, I highly recommend it. So check out those episodes of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, and I'll be sure to include links in the description. So to recap, I will defend at least two contentions here. The first is that neither divine revelation nor any form of theism are preconditions for knowledge because reason is autonomous. The second is that there are some people who do not believe God exists, much less know that he exists. And some of these non-theists imply atheism. My first contention we can call the autonomy of reason, and I will argue a form of objective idealism undercuts essential claims of presuppositional apologetics. I will also help us understand the metaphysical and epistemological presuppositions that underpin reason, judgment, and their relation to our knowledge more generally. My second contention constitutes the argument from Divine Hiddenness. It provides us with a negative answer to the question of whether or not God exists.
Hey guys, it's Justin. Sorry to interrupt, but we put a lot of time and effort into these episodes because we think it's very important that people come to think more carefully about religious ideas. And you're watching the episode, so you probably agree to some extent, and yet many of you, no, most of you even, are not even subscribed to the channel. Please, don't make it weird, just subscribe. Better yet, please consider supporting us by becoming a patron for early access to our content and other benefits. For example, if you support us at the $5 level, that means that we have to make a response video to a video of your choosing. Speaking of support, we want to thank Bike Mearns, Charles Hoffer, Robin Willems, and Ed Atkinson. The music featured in this episode is by Chicago-based band Casserole, and it's used with permission. Anyway, that's all. Back to the episode.
So let's now turn to objective idealism in my first contention. I want to point out at the start that my own sympathies regarding the science of knowledge, or what is called epistemology, are with Hume, Kant, and Hegel broadly. And the form of objective idealism I'll be defending here is roughly the view that reason is a fundamental and primitive idea. To use some Hegelian jargon, we can have knowledge of the world in and for itself by understanding any determinate concept in itself and then out of itself by way of negation. This dialectic implies that humans are rational animals, capable of reason or understanding reasons, to have certain beliefs by way of concepts or ideas, because the world itself has a rational and intelligible structure. Hegel helps us understand his view with his famous dictum that the rational is the real and the real is the rational. What this means is that the metaphysics of reality can be understood by the rational capacities of our minds. On this view, whatever is real must be discernible to mind, because knowing and being, thought and existence, are necessarily part of the same rational whole. In other words, thinking subjects can know the world because there is, in at least some sense, an identity between thought and existence. This is what makes objective idealism a form of idealism, and should be contrasted with subjective idealism, which is the view that the ontology of the world is constituted by purely mental objects, and any further material reality is ultimately illusory. Subjective idealism is most often associated with Bishop Berkeley and the empiricist tradition, but objective idealism is most often associated with Post-Kantians like Hegel, Schelling, and Fichte, and even some American pragmatists like C.S. Peirce and Wilfrid Sellars. The key to understanding objective idealism involves understanding several primitive notions. We will frequently refer to the human capacity for consciously understanding things as reason, rationality, and judgment. And I will use terms like reasons or justification to refer to considerations that count in favor of reasoning or judging in certain ways. It's important to realize that on objective idealism, reason in the sense of our capacity for understanding and in the sense of considerations that count in favor are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other. On this view, there is a continuum between our valid forms of thought and what we should believe about the world. Again, because knowing and being are necessarily part of the same rational whole. It is this essential feature of reason I will argue supports my first contention, the autonomy of reason. Before I can argue for the autonomy of reason, we must first be clear about the idea of reason's autonomy. The autonomy of reason constitutes freedom from external control or influence, and reason's independence from collective or individual desire or authority. The term autonomy is derived from the Greek word autonomos, meaning to have its own laws. Kant famously characterized his formula of autonomy, or categorical imperative, as the ability to act in accordance with self-given laws or rules, rather than the arbitrary appetites of our desires or the whims of some authority. I will argue similarly that reason is autonomous in the sense that reason is independent of any subject whatsoever, and reasoning is a self-governing act. All of the necessary conditions for knowledge are contained within our acts of reasoning and the objects of our judgment themselves. Contrary to Van Til and other presuppositional apologetics, the autonomy of reason implies that God cannot be a necessary condition of knowledge. I want to argue that the autonomy of reason is entailed by an understanding of reason's objectivity, self-consciousness, irreducibility, and universality. This is really important because these four features of reason are the heart of objective idealism and give non-Christians their own transcendental argument against presuppositional apologetics. The autonomy of reason implies that the preconditions of knowledge are contained entirely within reason itself. Reason is independent of any knower or object of judgment, but it also does not require us to go beyond them. Let's start with reason's objectivity. Reason is objective in the sense that the truth of judgment does not depend on any particular subjective character. So reason is general or universal enough to apply to any particular subject. The objectivity of reason arises when we conceive of the world as objects independent of subjective experiences and independent of subjective appearances. So it presupposes we are self-consciously aware there is a world independent of subjective experience. Subjective thought is characterized by the attitudes or responses of subjects towards the objects of their judgment, while objective thought is characterized by irreducible rules or principles about how subjects should, ought, or must think about the world. Now let's consider self-consciousness. Thinking or judgment that something is true contains within it the self-conscious awareness that it is a right or it is objectively valid to judge so. For example, I am self-consciously aware of my judgment that I have hands. I have the experience of my hands, and I have a concept of something having hands. I judge that I have hands. And that judgment also, in the same act, contains the judgment that it is right or correct in an irreducibly normative sense to believe that I have hands. Insofar as my judgment is objective, the judgment that I have hands is universal or independent of any given first-person characters or determinations of subjects that are not contained in this very judgment. So I do not need to go beyond the object of my judgment, say into a divine revelation, in order to have knowledge of it. Now consider irreducibility. Reason is also irreducible in the sense it is irreducibly normative, meaning that truths of reason or facts about what we should believe can be neither restated nor rephrased using non-normative concepts and terms. When we characterize a reason to believe something, we are given neither a causal nor empirical description of it. Rather, we characterize justifications about what self-consciousness should believe in what Wilfrid Sellars calls the logical space of reasons. The space of reasons describes the objective concepts and logical landscape that we use to intelligibly understand and navigate the world. That is, the a priori knowledge we have that makes our experiences of the world intelligible. Talk of reasons, epistemic justification, and intention are not the same as and cannot necessarily be mapped onto what Wilfrid Sellars calls the realm of law, or claims about causes and their effects in an external world. Contrary to presuppositional apologetics, the logical space of reasons provides us with a neutral ground where the question of God's existence or coherence can be considered in an impartial and universal way. Finally, let's consider the universality of reason. Reason is universal, meaning that any particular reason should convince any subject able and willing to consider it impartially, because its authority is general enough to apply to any particular self-consciousness, whatever. If it is the case that we ought to believe something for some reason, then that same reason, without exception, would also apply to any other subject in a similar epistemic position. The universality of reason is captured once again in Kant's formula of universal law, or categorical imperative. If there is a reason to believe something, then that truth is not relative to any particular subject. It is objective. For example, if it's the case that some argument is valid and has true premises, then it's the case that any subject who judges such an argument should, ought, or must accept its conclusion. Its conclusion would be a categorical imperative. These universal concepts of should, ought, and must are irreducibly normative or reason implying. It's important to notice that each of these characteristics implies the others. For example, the self-consciousness of reason implies its objectivity. If the self-consciousness of reason divides the world up into subjects and objects, and our reasoning contains within it the very judgment that it is valid, then the very concept of self-consciousness presupposes the objectivity of thought. Conversely, the very concept of the objectivity of thought presupposes the self-consciousness of thought, because an objective thought presupposes a self-conscious subject that is aware of the object of judgment. If reason is to be universal, then it must be objective. So the objectivity of reason also implies its universality. Additionally, the irreducibility of the logical space of reasons implies reason's objectivity, self-consciousness, and universality. So all these characteristics are, to borrow an analogy from Derek Parfit, climbing the same mountain from different sides, and they are meeting at the same peak, where this peak is a metaphor for what I've called the autonomy of reason. But if reason is autonomous, then it follows that God is not a necessary condition for our knowledge. So my first main contention was to argue Christian theism is not a precondition of knowledge. And objective idealism gives us a framework in which that contention is true. The argument from Divine Hiddenness is my second contention. And again, I will be brief here, as my co-host has already done an excellent job in explicating this argument. So I'll be sure to include a link in the description. The point of the argument here is to illustrate that objective idealism provides us with a neutral ground for Christians and non-Christians to disagree about the existence of God. Indeed, the non-Christian can argue God does not exist without any violence to his epistemic commitments. Let us now consider the argument from Divine Hiddenness. If God created us with a common purpose, then the revelation of that purpose would invite a widespread consensus about the nature, content, and significance of a shared revelation we were all directly acquainted with. However, there is not such widespread intersubjective experiences. Not everyone has theistic religious experiences, and most subjects of religious experience widely disagree about the fundamental nature, content, and significance of religious experience. Some people never believe or no longer believe God exists, and this non-theism is neither the result of emotional nor behavioral opposition towards God. For example, former theists were presumably already acquainted with God, and their loss of belief has ended that relationship. Lifelong seekers are open to finding or being found by God, but without ever achieving that goal. Isolated non-theists have never been in a position to resist belief because they've never had the idea of God. Hundreds of centuries of isolated non-theists have unavoidably lived their entire lives within the influence of a fundamentally misleading system of religious meaning if Christian theism were true. These evidential considerations, to my mind, decisively refute the claim everyone knows that God exists. And I doubt my judgment here would be idiosyncratic. The problem is that theism implies there are no non-resistant non-theists, because God's perfect love implies always being open to a relationship, which in turn implies every finite person also believes that God exists, unless they are somehow resisting such a belief. That's because a belief that someone exists is a necessary condition for a meaningful relationship with that person. It cannot be the case that we are in a meaningful, positive, reciprocating relationship with someone unless we also believe that they exist. So if theism is true, then there are no non-resistant non-theists. However, we just saw there are some non-resistant non-theists, like former believers, lifelong seekers, and isolated non-theists. So it follows that God does not exist. We have now arrived at a definite negative answer to our question of God's existence, or atheism, and we've all done it from a neutral ground. I have put my own transcendental argument for the autonomy of reason on the table in the form of objective idealism. And I've argued this defeats the presupposition that theism, much less Christian theism, is a necessary condition for knowledge. Finally, we saw how there are some non-resistant non-theists, implying there are some people who neither believe, much less know, that God exists. And we saw how the argument from Divine Hiddenness implies there are no non-resistant non-theists, which in turn implies atheism.